In this lesson, we're going to begin talking about how to create classes. And a class is a special type of object in Java that combines both attributes or ways of describing an object and behaviors or ways that a object does things. And Java, being an object-oriented programming language, is built entirely out of objects that are created from a class definition. So what we're going to do in this first lesson, when we talk about creating classes and object-oriented programming, is just demonstrate the basics of how a class is created. There's lots of individual parts. What I'm going to do here is concentrate primarily on how to start a class definition and then how to add some pieces that describe the attributes or data that's stored in a class. So for now, we're going to create our class definition inside a class that we create for our main program. So to do that, we have to create what's called a static class. And the class I'm going to be creating through these next few lessons is a class that keeps track of the time. So we're just going to call that time. And the class definition, like any other object, will be delimited with an open and closed curly brace. So that's what I've done right here. So I've created the open brace to start the definition of the class and the closed brace to close it. Later on, I'll demonstrate how to get this outside of the main class, which is just the name of my program, CreateClass. But for now, we're going to work inside to make it a little bit easier. When we talk about classes and class definitions, we often distinguish between what are called private members or private methods and public members and public methods. Primarily, when we're creating classes, we want to keep the data of that class private. And by that, I mean we want to make it where you can't just easily access the data of a class, because we want to be able to constrain the values that will go into that. For example, if we're keeping track of the time, then we have some very strict constraints on the different data members that make up the time. For example, the hours. We can keep track of a time using either a 24-hour format or a 12-hour format. But regardless of which one we choose, we can't have a time ever greater than really 23:59, because 24, the hour 24 actually begins a new day. So we might start with the 0 hour and then go through 23:59, but never actually have a 24. By making the data member private, then we can say that, or we can create code that will constrain how the user enters an hour so that they can't enter an hour greater than 23, for example. And we'll get to that later on. For now, we're just going to demonstrate how to create that piece. And we're going to do it by writing the words private int hour. The hour is going to be stored as an integer, and we want to make that private, which means that we can't access the value of that variable, although we don't call it a variable here, we call it a data member, outside of the definition of the class itself. That'll make more sense later on down the line. So we'll keep track of the minute, and we'll also keep track of the second of that time, so that a time object excuse me, a time object can consist of an hour, a minute, and a second, even though those could also be default values. To demonstrate an example of a public member, we could write this. And that could be some property that will display the time in a way that you can access it through the object's public interface, and that's another word we need to talk about, the interface. The interface is how we interact with an object. Anything that's private is part of the private interface and cannot be accessed directly. Any object or any piece of the class that's public can be accessed directly. So let's review what we've talked about, because I've thrown a whole lot of terms at you at one time. A class is a way to keep track of the behavior and the attributes of an object. We create a class definition by writing public static class time, although we can also take the static out and put that up in a more public area outside the main definition of our program, or the main class definition, and I'll demonstrate that later. Inside the class definition is where we're going to define both the data that we're keeping track of, hour, minute, second, as well as the behaviors, which I haven't demonstrated yet. This last one, public int vtime, is almost more like a property, because being public, we can set that, and that's really going to be a problematic to do so. This really needs to be a read-only property that we can use to display the time at any particular point in an object's lifetime. Again, a lot of the things I'm going to need to talk about have to be deferred till we get to that specific lesson. But just to give you an idea of what a public method could look like. And again, this is very, very simplified. See, I'm just writing a method definition, and I'm taking the parameters and assigning them, or the arguments, and assigning them to the private members, so that if we create an object, a time object, and want to set the time, we can provide an hour, a minute, and a second. And then I could also write something like this, and we're going to do this in more detail later. And then display the time using a common colon format like so. So those are just a couple of little pieces of a class definition, and I'll get into more detail later, but I just wanted to give you an introduction to creating a class, and then we'll get into the specifics as we go along. So that's going to wrap up this lesson on creating classes, and we're going to move to the next lesson where I'm going to show you how to create a very important method that every class needs to have, and that's a constructor method.